In college, I used a program called 3D Studio Max. At the time, that program cost $3,000. When I graduated and lost access to it, my options were take out one final loan to pay for it, or hope I get a job from my existing portfolio alone. I did get a job, but when that was over, I was back at square one. Fun fact for a lot of industries, but especially art, you may or may not be allowed to show professional work in your portfolio. On your resume, you may or may not be allowed to disclose what clients you worked for. I wasn't allowed to say anything other than, I created photorealistic renders for a major American retailer. As an artist, you will rely on your portfolio to prove what you can do. And it's especially important for people who don't have a lot of experience or haven't built up a network yet. So I needed to work on that, without access to the tools I needed to do it. I ended up switching industries entirely, first as a stopgap, but then as it became harder to find art jobs. I always thought I'd find my way back, but by the time I had saved up enough money to buy 3D Studio Max and start work on my portfolio again, they had changed their payment model. It was subscription-based, and it cost $200 per month. Between rent and loans, I simply couldn't afford that. I used the money saved to buy other software I needed, ZBrush and Substance Painter and Designer, which at the time were perpetual licenses. Then I found Blender and started the painfully difficult task of learning a whole new 3D software package. There is fundamental art-based knowledge I will keep no matter what software I use. But that was still a big loss. There's a reason whatever niche you occupy, people will fight about tools. Spend any time in the 3D art space and you will watch people go to war for Blender versus Maya or Cinema 4D. And the reason is because they don't want to lose their skills. I was good at Max. I was a person my classmates often went to for help. After graduating, I taught classes on it. And when I didn't have access to it anymore, a big chunk of my hard-earned knowledge was gone. Working a full-time job, it took me years to get to the same level with Blender. If you are a person who relies on software as tools for your job or hobby or whatever, you always run this risk now. You could become an expert at something and someone will just come and take your tools away. And there's nothing you can do.
Wait! Of course the makers of 3D Studio Max know all that. They know people need to use these programs for work, to stay on top of updates between jobs, to keep their portfolios fresh in the specialized field. There is another way to pay. Flex pricing.
What does that mean?
Basically, you pay every time you open the software.
That seems expensive. How much does it cost to open it?
Do you remember Chuck E. Cheese? Well, we have a similar token-based system.
So you buy a token to open the software.
That way you aren't paying for time you don't use it.
How much is a token?
Well, 6 tokens.
What?
It takes 6 tokens to open your preferred software.
Why wouldn't you just make it 1?
Dirty Pizza Rat.
Okay. How much do the tokens cost? Oh, wow. That's a lot. Wait, that isn't math right. If it costs 6 tokens to open and you sell them per 100, then I'm left with a remainder.
Well...
Oh, because each program costs a different amount to open. Well, I guess that's a benefit, that I can use any program.
Not all products, features, services, or benefits are available with Flex.
Of course. And if I open it and use it longer than 24 hours, I'll get charged 6 more tokens, and they expire after a year? So really it costs money to use per 24-hour period.
Still saving money for occasional users.
Are you, though? According to this, if I open it more than 7 days in a month, then it costs roughly the same as it does per year.
Less than 7 would be occasional.
Okay, special occasion. I get to work. Yeah, might as well. What happens if I open it and lose power or internet? Do I just lose the rest of those hours?
Contact support.
Okay, so screw you is the answer. This isn't a joke. This is really their pricing plan. I am on their website.
If you don't use 3D software, do you feel good right now? Feeling safe?
I think we can all agree that subscription services are way out of control at this point. But as everything from software to TV to your car's heated seats converts to subscription-based pricing, and as profiteers reach a ceiling with how much money they could make that way, do you think terrible ideas like these are going to stay confined to just one company?
Do they ever?
Companies will always find a way to
innovate and profit.
In 2015, Junya Motomura, the technical artist for Arc Systems Works Red Team, gave a talk at GDC explaining how they created the art for GuiltyGearXrd. There's a lot of good info in it, so I'll post a link below in case you want to watch. In the talk, Junya expressed the importance of intention. For the project, they wanted to use 3D programs to mimic a 2D look. Before starting any work, they researched ways to do that and what challenges they'd face. A few notable things were movement. In 2D animation, you have an animator drawing a picture for every frame. 24 frames equals 1 second. Oftentimes, you'll hear animators say something is drawn on 1s, 2s, 3s, etc. That means a drawing is held for that amount of frames. So if you have 24 frames to animate on 3s, you'll only need 8 drawings. Within a full animation, you would change up the amount depending on several factors. There's a lot more to this, but basically the more frames you draw, the smoother the animation becomes. But that takes more time and effort. In 3D, we have something called interpolation. This allows an animator to set key poses, and the computer can automate what happens in between them. So you can get really smooth on-one's animation with less work. However, if you're trying to mock 2D with 3D, then interpolation can break the illusion. We're not used to seeing 2D animation on ones for entire features. Interpolation can also make things like timing, anticipation, arcs, and other fundamentals harder to manage. So if you want that 2D look, you need to animate the same way you would in 2D. So no interpolation, or very little, and the animator creates a pose for every nth frame. Another issue they encountered for Guilty Gear was light and shadow. For the most part, lighting in a 3D simulation is meant to replicate real-life lighting. But cartoons don't always follow those same rules. For example, with the sphere on the left, its shadows look soft, and the colors gradually get darker as less light hits it. On the right, the more cartoony sphere abruptly shifts from a light to dark color. The line delimiting the shadow is distinct with a hard edge. There is no gradual change from light to dark. And unfortunately, there's no single solution to this. Once your model is more complex than a sphere, or once you have a whole scene, it becomes harder to control the artist's intention. In this example, I've attempted to smooth the face shadows for the model on the right using a combination of shaders, strategically animated light, and editing the normals. The last of which changes how the 3D simulated light sees the surface so that it sees it smoother than it actually is and doesn't create awkward shadows like it's doing on the left. This is far from a perfect example. It's actually a really difficult thing to do. The Guilty Gear team did an incredible job. For every problem they found, they devised a solution. Oftentimes those were multi-part, as in the case with light and shadow. Junya emphasized the fact that all their solutions could have been done in any software. Softimage XSI, which was what they used, wasn't special. Naturally, at the end of the talk, someone asked if Softimage was special and if they could do these things in other software packages. The exact question was, were there some key features of XSI that you could only do in XSI for this game? And Junya's response was, I wouldn't want to do it in any other software. That is simply because you could just go back to any state and continue fiddling with the model without redoing the skins or redoing the UVs. The normal editing is pretty good in Softimage. I'm pretty sure how Maya and 3D Studio Max do it, but as much as I know, 3D Studio Max has some problems with the normal editing. At the time, XSI had great tools and plugins to help them with that. I touched on the normal editing when we went over lighting and shadow, but the other thing he mentioned here was the ability to go back and edit without redoing things. That was possible because of the node-based editor, which he demoed at different times during the talk. Node-based editing is a type of non-destructive workflow, meaning everything you do can be undone without destroying your source information. If you've ever used Photoshop, using layers in a stack with masks is one way of doing this. For instance, you can cut something out of a photo without actually cutting it out. You can always go back to edit the mask and change how the cutout looks. Node-based editors are a type of visual programming, the concept of which has been around longer than any 3D software. Here's an example of a node-based editor. So you start on the left with the thing you want to edit, also called the input. In our case, it's an image of a white square. On the right, you'd have your output. Then in between, you'd use other nodes to edit the input information. So say I wanted to take this white square and make it black. I could add an invert node, connect them, and there you go. What's great about this is that if I ever needed to edit something, it would just be a matter of changing what's in between. If I did something more complex and needed to edit a lower level, I could retain the edits after without having to redo them. And it's always like this. If you're learning a new piece of software and it has a node editor, it's going to function pretty much the same way as any other node editor you've used. What makes this especially powerful is that if you know how the software is reading the input information, you don't need to rely on the specialized nodes. In our example, that being the invert. So for instance, I know this program reads the image as a series of red, green, and blue values. It stores each channel as a float from 0 to 1. For white, it stores red 1, green 1, and blue 1. Since black is the opposite, it stores that as red 0, green 0, and blue 0. So if I wanted to make this image black without the use of an invert node, what could I do? The answer is just subtract 1. In a visual coding environment, math is the most basic way to edit something. Typically, there are math nodes given for any node editor. So here, I grab one of those, subtract 1, and now I have a black square. This frees me from having to know what specialized nodes a software package may have. And if all software had this, it would be easier to learn something new. If you're looking for a new program to edit music, videos, images, 3D, or anything, check to see if they have a node editor. The example I'm basing this off of is in Blender's shader editor. Guess I could have just screen recorded doing it in there. Didn't have to animate all this. In 2011, when they started development for GuiltyGearXrd, XSI was unique for having this option, then called ICE. When Junya said they could easily redo things if their models changed, that's what he was relying on. So, the software did matter once their pipeline was underway. If they had to switch software, they would need to rethink their methods. They might need to create new tools to deal with whatever limitations the new software has. So in the end, it will require more time, more work, and more money. Here's an interesting fact. Autodesk, the inventors of that flex payment system we covered earlier, owned both Softimage XSI and 3ds Max. They also own another 3D software package called Maya. In 1988, 3ds Max was created by a licensing agreement with Autodesk and the Yoast Group. In 1997, Yoast sold the rights to their source code for Max to Autodesk. In 2005, Autodesk acquired Maya. In 2008, they acquired Softimage. These aren't even the only 3D software packages Autodesk owns. Their history is filled with acquisitions of duplicate and similar products. But to summarize, at the time of Junya's talk, Autodesk owned 3 different software packages that roughly did the same thing.
Class, can you guess what happened next?
Flash was originally released as Future Splash Animator by Futurewave in May of 1996. I think a lot of us remember Flash as being the program that let people create things like Salad Fingers, Strong Bad, and Charlie the Unicorn, and endless Flash games. Whole creator communities formed at sites like Newgrounds and early YouTube, which was all Flash at the time. But I think we forget that Flash was also used to make websites, like the entire thing. This is what the original site for Flash looked like. Isn't it beautiful? Macromedia approached FutureWave in November of 1996. No, actually, wait. What does demo mean? And samples. Will they load? No. Other sites. Wonder if any of these will work. Oh, some of them are cool. Adam Watkins, a 16-year-old web enthusiast, has created this fun website using many Future Splash animator buttons and animations. All right, I'll check it out. Oh, wow. Remember enter screens? I'm going to blur his picture there, but it was his picture. He's 43 now, but I don't know. It just still feels weird because he's a kid there. But I still wanted to show a part of it because I think it's neat that he made this for his website. It's cool when people make art just because they want to. And yes, I think websites can be art. My name is Adam Watkins, and I'm from Ohio. Wadsworth, Ohio, to be exact. Okay, the 90s were a different time. New, talk to me. I want to hear from you. You can now leave me an audio message that will then be emailed to me. That's pretty cool. All you have to do is call this toll-free number. When it asks for a PIN number, type in, Adam, how did you set this up when you were 16? It's cool. Hot links. Oh, remember when we called them hot links? Pee Wee Herman worship page. All right. Butt page. Read all the stories about butts you want to read. I'll come back to that one later. Hooters. A very nice pair. All right. Look, someone actually fell for it. 27 years later, and he still got someone. That's impressive. Okay, last side. I just need to know what jumping bean is, I promised, and we'll get back to whatever this is. Should I know by this point in the writing? Jumping bean, animated screen beans. Oh, look how his nose wobbles when he moves. This animation is in 4K. They knew about 4K in the 90s? Okay, so Screen Beans got a hold of the FutureWave beta called Cell Animator. That's a nice fact. Help me, I must own beans right now. I mean, yeah, absolutely. Tired of boring clip art? Yes, and it is a constant problem. Please give me an order form. Oh, gonna hide that address. Probably not the Screen Beans HQ anymore. Probably. Praise, complaints, and suggestions. You know, we don't ask for praise enough on the web in 2024. Put your praise down below, please. Try some free without any guilt now that you've ordered your own. I didn't order any. I can't, but okay. Freebie and the beans. The clip art files below are available for you to try out a sample file or free to use them in your website, in presentations, in documents, in whatever you enjoy. Ah, jackpot. Okay, sorry. Back to the video. In December 1996, FutureWave was acquired by Macromedia, then becoming Flash 1.0. You're wrong, Wikipedia, just FYI. It's only a month off, but I doubt this article I found called The History of Flash that was written by a co-founder of the company and posted on Adobe's website is wrong. Heh, got him. Actually, what am I doing? Wikipedia is an editable website. Okay. I forget it sometimes, but it's always better to help if you can, rather than just clowning on something. Once Macromedia acquired Flash, the official site changed to... Oh, this one isn't animated. But I am going to get distracted again. Look at the stars. They're so attention-getting. Okay, so Flash 1.0 costs $249. That's not bad, and it's a perpetual license. Flash 2.0 was $199, and no, that wasn't an introductory offer. The price remained the same for years after the intro. They just kept changing the intro message until the site got all boring and corporate. Flash 3 cost $299, so a $100 increase or $50 increase from version 1, but this price remained until version 5 when it became $399. But even then, they had deals where an upgrade would cost $149. All of this is still a perpetual license. So for the most part, Flash was affordable in those early years, at least for a working middle-class adult or a teenager with rich parents like Adam. It also ran on home computers, which these days is something we don't really think about. Most software, particularly work-related software like Word, Photoshop, some third thing, will run on our computers. Take this quote from an Autodesk product manager from 1996. This is a turning point in the price-performance continuum. You get the performance of a high-priced workstation software on an inexpensive PC. So this very powerful software for the time was something the average person could get. In those early years, Flash filled several niches. 1, making videos. It wasn't like today where we have many different formats, editors, and browsers capable of playing them. The early adoption of Shockwave players allowed Flash to fill that slot. Number 2, making websites. As demonstrated earlier, this allowed animations within websites for links, graphics, and interactivity. And third, because of the robust toolset for animations and the fact that it came packaged with its own programming language, people could also make games with it. Because of all these different uses, price, ease of use, and ubiquitous browser adoption at the time, Flash took off. Businesses likewise picked it up. Even back when it was Future Splash, both Microsoft and Disney were early adopters. So, then what happened? Previously, FutureWave had approached Adobe about a buyout, but they turned them down. Once things took off with Macromedia, Adobe came back, like COVID. Adobe officially acquired Macromedia in December of 2005, adding to its massive roster. In an online FAQ section directed mostly to Adobe and newly acquired Macromedia employees, Adobe leadership answered questions about the acquisition and what was going to happen next. Question: will there be a reduction in force as a result of this acquisition? So in my experience, companies usually just lie here. We will do an internal review, but hope to keep new Macromedia family members, something like that. Yes. Oh, stuff was different in the early 2000s. During the week following the close of the transaction, Adobe will begin eliminating positions from the combined workforce. The reduction will eliminate duplicate positions. Didn't feel like eliminating duplicate ideas from this paragraph, though, did ya? And enable Adobe to reprioritize headcount resources as it positions the combined company for a long-term success. Charges and headcount impact associated with the reduction in force, as well as other costs related to the acquisition, will be discussed during Adobe's fiscal 2005 year-end earnings conference call scheduled for December 15th, 2005. So, they let people go right before the holidays. At the time of the acquisition, several other notable things were happening. 1, websites. The web itself evolved, and so did the open source tech it was based on. We eventually could make fun animations if we wanted, without Flash. But more so than anything creative or animated, people gravitated towards standards. There were many technical issues with having a Flash-based website, but one that I don't hear as much about is just the UI. I did a lot of research for this project on the Wayback Machine, or archive.org, which is a cool site that allows you to visit snapshots of websites and how they looked in the past. If you try it out and you go all the way back to like the 90s, one thing you'll notice immediately is how different every site looked. We hadn't established things like hamburger menus and expanded navigation, let alone be able to do that with existing code. So everyone did things a little differently. Flash-based sites in particular were often unique, interactive experiences. The problem with uniqueness is that it can confuse people, and that's really bad if you're trying to sell something. These days, the design has been normalized, especially for retail businesses. You have a header that will include things like the main menu, search, and link to the homepage, usually as a logo image, then the main content, then the footer, which will include links people don't visit as much, as well as copyright info. On every internal page, you have the same header and footer in the same place. The idea that you might not have that or a way to easily track back is a foreign concept at this point. For better or worse, this is the design pattern that evolved. Businesses adopted it, and now the typical user understands it. You don't deviate from it because you may potentially frustrate a user enough that they'll just leave. So, if you didn't need a unique, animated, interactive experience, why were you using Flash? You would gain nothing, and you'd inherit all the technical problems and bloat that Flash had. So, people stopped using it to build websites. Macromedia was aware of these problems before Adobe purchased them. There were plans to make Flash into something that could translate down to more web-friendly code, but they didn't do that right away. Instead, they fired people. And if you've ever been part of a layoff, particularly one that's the result of a merger or acquisition, you know that some institutional knowledge is always lost. Not saying that's the reason it took them so long to update Flash. Lots of people have speculated and written about that, but whatever the reason, we know it took them too long to adapt. 2 years after Adobe's acquisition of Macromedia, something interesting happened. the iPhone was introduced. This dramatically changed things for every pillar of Flash's appeal. 3 years after that, Steve Jobs released his notorious Thoughts on Flash letter to the public, which admonished Adobe for all of Flash's flaws. That's right, 5 years after they purchased Flash, they still hadn't fixed its issues. In the letter, Jobs detailed how Apple had a special partnership with Adobe and tried to work with them directly, but despite multiple requests to update the security, size, and speed of Flash applications, Adobe just didn't. Adobe's co-founders, Warnock and Geschke, who had a sort of frenemies relationship with Jobs, penned their own letter refuting all of Jobs' points. Adobe also launched an ad complaining about the breakup. I read the press release in college with my friends, in our Flash class, that most of us are still paying off. In Jobs' letter, he explained the policy updates that effectively banned Flash applications in their store, or really third-party apps that are closed connections, which Adobe filed a lawsuit against, which was cheaper than software development, I guess. This schism wasn't the full reason for Flash's fall, but it cemented their block out on mobile devices, which at the time was really just Apple's market, and if you couldn't play with them, you were out. Flash, the program, still exists, but Adobe rebranded it to Animate. It also now costs $20.99 per month. $20.99 times 12 is $251.88, which, to be fair, is what the license costs for version 1.0, $249, before any price increases. Except that was perpetual. Now you have to pay that price per year. Also, JK, it now costs $22.99 per month, or $275.88 per year. The price went up as I was writing this. Get used to that being a theme. Adobe did eventually fix the issues Flash had. You are able to export more supported video files if you make animations with it. For web and games, it could translate down to something that runs natively in browsers. There's a lot of conjecture over what really killed Flash, which is why I covered so much of the history. But really, if I were a teenager now, Adam Jr., and I wanted to make websites, first off, I'd be a unicorn because no one does that anymore, but I'd choose JavaScript, CSS, and HTML because it's free. If I wanted to make games, there's multiple game engines that are free to learn and several other videos there, moving on. If I want to make animations, there's multiple software packages that don't cost what Flash does for both 2D and 3D. But now you're pigeonholed into that thing. What was cool about Flash is that if you learned it, it had all these different uses. Maybe you learned it to do web, but realized that wasn't for you and animations were. Maybe you were an animator, but kept leaning into games. And since rebranding to Animate, Adobe has changed the program. They narrowed its focus because no one needs this to make websites or games. The tools have changed, so it isn't the same Flash anymore. How many times will a person learn the intricacies of a software package only for that to become obsolete? How many times can you go through that? How many times can I? What happened to the people who were experts in Flash? Lots of them moved to other software and tech I mentioned above, but I know some people who loved animating in Flash, and they've never found a replacement, so they just stopped animating. I spent a lot of time looking through old Flash games and animations on archive.org, and yeah, a lot of them were amateur or just refits of other games or older games. But some were also really good. I enjoyed this one with the paddle ball, for instance. The controls were surprisingly comfortable, and I found it soothing. Everything learned is the result of dedication and work you put into it. Some people may naturally pick up something faster, but even if they do, that's not a promise they'll master it. If you love doing something, it's possible to master it even if you suck at first. Or for a long time, I would know. But learning isn't easy. People put hours, weeks, months into this piece of software, and for a confluence of reasons, it went away. I know toward the end we were overflowing with Flash content, but I feel for the people who lost it, who couldn't afford Animate or didn't like its changes, and who never found an alternative tool, or simply never had the time to put into learning another one.
To whom it may concern, I couldn't finish it in time for them, but maybe this will help somebody else. B. Russell.
any software that exists, you're going to have competition in the market. So from a business perspective, it makes sense to buy that competition, because then you can make more money. Oh, hey, my business degree just arrived. They emailed it to me. Gonna print this out. WebP, why do you still exist? I'll fix it later. As explained previously, Autodesk owned all the major 3D software packages of the time. Somehow that was legal, and it was a loss to anyone who couldn't afford their pricing or people whose favorite software was discontinued. But I understand. Keeping all three updated and consistently improved triples the cost without much benefit, especially if they know their customers don't have anywhere else to go that's comparable. As it stands, Autodesk still has Maya and 3ds Max. They're different products, but both count as generalized 3D software. They actually have a page on their website dedicated to explaining the differences and which one a customer should choose. 3ds Max got full node editing by 2016 because they had ported them over from XSI. They took the parts that people loved and put that in other 3D packages they had, and I'm glad they did that. A lot of 3D software is based on the same math and science. Much of the early research for that came from the University of Utah, which received contracts from the US government in the 60s and 70s to develop various graphical technologies. For instance, when you create an object in 3D space, you have to tell the computer how light should interact with its surface. These various functions are called shaders. Shaders can make something look rough or shiny, flat or bumpy, dull or glowy, and everything in between. And each visual property had to be developed. One of the earliest shaders, or shading algorithms, was Phong. It was proposed by Bui Tuong Phong in his 1973 dissertation for the University of Utah, entitled Illumination for Computer-Generated Images. It was later re-edited and published in a 1975 paper as well. Phong defined shaders as a function which yields the intensity value of each point on the body of an object from the characteristics of the light source, the object, and the position of the observer. Phong was an attempt to make surfaces look more realistically shiny. In 1977, James F. Blinn published a paper, Models of Light Reflection for Computer-Synthesized Pictures, which improved on Phong's approach, introducing the Blinn-Phong model. Every early piece of 3D software implemented Blinn-Phong. They might have been writing in different languages, using different graphical stacks, but it was the same underlying approach. I think there's different types of invention. One is something that springs from solid ground, Blinn-Phong. They're incremental but important and necessary steps. Another is something everyone knows we need, but it's so complex that even if we were to follow the path of incremental progress, we still wouldn't get there. We would need an entirely different approach. At this point, there are many different shaders out there, with people writing their own all the time. Much is still shared between them. ZBrush and Substance Painter were programs that rethought the entire approach to specific 3D problems, especially ZBrush. Pixelogic presented ZBrush at SIGGRAPH in 1999. Following the pattern of everything we've seen so far, their website was way cooler prior to 2005. ZBrush is software that allows you to sculpt in 3D, similar to how you would with clay. A lot of its tools are based on common clay shaping tools. There are several different ways to model objects in 3D, and with each you'd use a different type of 3D object. Some of those are splines or curves. Depending on the software you use, the terminology may change. Polygons or faces. NURBS, which stands for non-uniform rational B-splines, and if you learn what that is, you get to say it, that's the treat, was again a type of spline. There's more to it than that, but the point is there's different ways to model something in 3D on a computer. There's a lot more if we consider real life. All 3D software has tools and methods of doing each type of modeling, and each type of modeling has its pros and cons. Personally, I stick to polymodeling and sometimes use splines for things they're just better at, like creating vases. Okay, they're more useful than that, but moving on. A polygon, which you might remember from geometry class, is a plane with at least 3 sides. It's made up of vertices, edges, and faces. When you do polymodeling, you are pushing and pulling on those individual elements within the polygons. 1 polygon means you have a plane, 2 or more means you have an element, or an island. Multiple non-connected elements, or 1 connected element, are called an object. Remember when we talked about shaders and Blinn-Phong? The way you choose to lay out this geometry in an object heavily affects how the shader can display it. So when you do this sort of modeling, you have to be aware of that, otherwise you'll create distortions that make it hard for you and the program to understand the shape. If you spend enough time doing this, you get pretty fast at it. However, complex forms like, for example, a human face or clothing will be more time-consuming. And it becomes harder to prototype because you're constrained by how fast you can edit these baser elements without making a mess of the geometry. That's why ZBrush was such an innovation. It's still using geometry, but it obscures that from you. It gives you a more intuitive way of working because we can all understand how to push and pull on a mass of clay. You probably noticed in their name, Pixelogic, not Pixel Logic. A pixel is color information. The makers of ZBrush created the Pixel, which, according to this article from 2000 in Design Graphics Magazine number 57, pixels do much, much, much more. They have up to 64 channels of information, and in the hands of Pixelogic's programmers, they are unbelievably fast. The Pixel is proprietary information. So unless you worked on ZBrush, it's hard to say exactly what's going on under the hood. But with this tech, Pixelogic was able to create something that blew past other 3D software of the time, and even now. I have a fairly good computer, but as soon as I get into the 3 to 5 million range in Blender, stuff starts to lag. If I somehow fall into the 10 million range, I'm getting a lot of weight wheels. With ZBrush, I regularly, comfortably work with 10 to 50 million poly models. One of the secrets of ZBrush is its so-called 2.5D space. It doesn't render or display 3D objects, similar to how other software does. Again, it's hard to find information about what it's exactly doing, but when it launched, it was more about creating 2D pictures with 3D puffy paint. When you start the program, or at least the latest version I have, which is from 2022, you have to add an object and then switch to poly mode. Otherwise, you're just painting and not actually editing your model. I've seen people theorize that rather than continually keeping track of every vertex in space, similar to other software, it's setting you back to that 2.5D space on every move. Then when you turn the model, it stores what you've done to that slice and applies it. But that's just something I've heard speculated. This isn't open source, so we don't know. If you have thoughts about what it's doing, or know something that I don't, I'd love to hear it. Tech aside, you can see how going from poly modeling to this opens up a whole new world for artists. Almost immediately, the 3D community embraced this software. It rapidly became an industry standard for games, animation, and film. To this day, it continues to be extremely popular and with few real competitors. One of the things that I believed helped this wide adoption was its unique pricing model. You ready? A perpetual license. In 1999, ZBrush 1 commercial license was put on sale for a special intro price of $292.50. After that expired, it sold for $585. Similar to how Flash worked, ZBrush 1.5 went on sale for $399, which was less than version 1. ZBrush 2 expanded the options, allowing you to purchase a CD as well. It sold for $489. ZBrush 3.1 to 3.12 sold for $595. 4 sold for $699. 4R6 sold for $795. 4R7 and 4R8, wait, they have merch? When did that happen? I want a ZBrush t-shirt. Anyway, 4R7 and 4R8 kept that $795 price point, but around this time we see the introduction of ZBrush Core, a limited version of the product that sold for the heavily reduced price of $149.95. In 2018, they ditched their old naming conventions, and what would have likely been ZBrush 5 now became ZBrush 2018. Surprisingly, to me, they still kept the price at $795. All these prices have been for their single-user licenses, which allowed commercial use. Along the way, they've added other licenses such as educational, volume, and floating. But for their prior 19 years, their single-user license was a one-time purchase with free upgrades for life. At this point, we all saw the writing on the wall. It was a common thing on popular 3D forums from the time, Polycount, Pixelogic's own ZBrush Central, to see people say they wouldn't mind paying for upgrades. But that was never an option that was given. Finally, for ZBrush 2019, they introduced a subscription-based pricing model, $39.95 a month or $179.95 every 6 months. Surprisingly, they still offered that perpetual free upgrades for life options, now at $8.95. In 2021, Pixelogic's assets, including ZBrush, was acquired by Maxon, which is another 3D software company rival to Autodesk. I really like how this Reddit post put it, though. Maxon acquires Pixelogic, and the world cries out in terror. That was the vibe. Personally, ZBrush was the program that I was able to have when I couldn't afford Max, and before I knew Blender even existed. Even when I found Blender, I still relied on ZBrush while I learned. I spent a lot of nights, weekends, and holidays sculpting in ZBrush, and I loved every minute of it. Maxon immediately did away with perpetual licenses. Your options now are monthly at $39, which to be fair is 95 cents cheaper than Pixelogic's terms, I guess. Or you can pay $359 annually, which breaks down to $29.91 a month. And I should say these are the prices as of February 20th, 2024, which is when I'm writing this. Update as of January 2025, ZBrush is now $49 per month. This is a song I never. Like I said before, there is no competitor to ZBrush. Blender Sculpt isn't there yet, in my opinion, although people like it and do really cool work with it. The closest I found is Nomad, which is limited to tablets. So, I'll carry the underlying art fundamentals, but I'm losing another tool. Oh wait, Mudbox. That's another alternative. Not that anyone cares. And you can tell it sucks because Autodesk made it affordable. Anyway, I know it's just a matter of time before my perpetual license doesn't work with new hardware or an updated OS. I know that's going to happen because it already did once, with that other software that was a game changer for several industries. Update, because they keep happening and I don't know where to put them anymore. At some point between 2023 and now, January 12th, 2025, Autodesk upped the price of 3ds Max. I'd look up the exact date, but if I take the time to do that, then every other software I mentioned in this video may update their price, and then I'm just stuck in a never-ending loop of wanting to finish this, but can't because they keep changing their prices, and 3ds Max is now $245 per month instead of $235. Also, if you're a Mudbox fanboy upset about my comment in the last section, well, I have some good news for the both of you. Out of all the software I've talked about in this video, Mudbox is the only one whose price actually went down. It now costs $10 a month instead of $15. The only one that went down. During the 2014 GDC, Algorithmic, the makers of Substance products, hosted a panel with EA Dice to talk about their experience using Substance and the new PBR workflows in their pipeline. Substance Painter was unique at the time because up until then, again, this is 2014, so not that long. No, oh my God, that was 10 years ago. I wrote that line in 2023. The tools for creating textures in 3D were somewhat limited. When you view an object in 3D, how do you imagine you get color onto it? You'd probably assume there was some way to just paint on the model, right? Unfortunately, up until 2014, those ways were limited. That's not the case anymore, and several 3D packages have tools to do this. Back then, you could do this by vertex painting. Old school games in the PlayStation 1, 2, and N64 eras created a lot of their environment colors like this, but it operated per vertex, so to get more dynamic colors, you'd need more vertices, so higher poly objects, which wasn't possible in older game systems. Another way to get color onto 3D objects is to follow a process called unwrapping. Basically, you take the 3D object, give it seams similar to how clothing patterns are done, and lay it out flat. Then you take that flat template and paint directly on it in a program like Photoshop. The reason you need a secondary 2D program is because the tools for painting and image manipulation are a lot more robust in those. The above methods are how the various 3D industries operated for a long time. And just to be clear, those methods didn't go extinct. Sometimes it's just easier to paint something in Photoshop or use vertex painting on low poly objects to get that retro feel. Some people simply prefer older workflows, or they like to work directly with the tools provided by their 3D program or game engine. Now, anything you look at IRL isn't just color. It's a combination of the shader attributes mentioned earlier. So when you start creating more complex or realistic objects, there's situations where something could be, for instance, red and shiny all over and dull or dirty only in particular spots. Modern shaders like Principled BSDF give you multiple channels to input that data, and each channel can have its own image texture, most of them as a black and white map indicating each end of the attribute spectrum. So you need a tool that will allow you to individually paint all these attributes, and ideally you want to see that in real time as you're painting it, rather than switching back and forth from Photoshop to your 3D program. Substance Painter did that. And once you understand Painter, something that used to take an hour could take you maybe 15 minutes. Texture work was never my favorite, but Substance changed that. It kind of changed everything. There were some competitors at the time. One I tried was a middleware add-on called Quixel Suite. It similarly let you view your 3D model as you painted, but it allowed you to work directly in Photoshop. That was discontinued around 2018 and replaced with Mixer, which is their standalone tool. Quixel Mixer still exists, but it was acquired by Epic Games in 2019. Luckily, that means, at least for now, it's free to use if you want to try it out. Algorithmic, the company who owned and developed Substance Painter, had a previous flagship program called Designer. Both tools have a learning curve, in my opinion, but Designer is definitely the steeper one. Remember when we had the discussion about nodes? That's what Designer is. Instead of painting your textures by hand, you create them procedurally. What you're looking at now is all math. Pauline Boiter is one of the most incredible artists I've ever seen. And I think it's hard to wrap your head around, but when I say this is all math, I mean every detail. For instance, the flowers on this dress, she modeled each petal individually with nodes using black and white maps. Here's a demo of how she did one. Do you ever just become speechless by someone's work? Creating textures procedurally has its pros and cons, the biggest one being that it's expensive to render and heavier on your system. The pro is that it's infinitely scalable. You'll never run into a situation where you zoom in on something that starts to pixelate. In this example, I'm using Blender's procedural brick node texture on the left and a baked out version of that on the right. From far away, they look the same, but the closer I get, you'll start to see a breakdown of the image texture version. If this were in a digital 3D space, as you moved closer, the details would become more visible, not less, just like real life. Well, unless you're farsighted or nearsighted. Anyway, both Painter and Designer have non-destructive workflows, meaning, as Junya said previously, you can go back and edit a root layer or node without breaking everything that comes after it. At launch, Substance Painter was $75. I'm just going to give that a minute. Perpetual license, $75. Designer and Painter together were free t-shirts? Free licenses by drawing lots is cool. What did the shirts look like, though? Together, Designer and Painter were $150. By 2017, they were $299 with the introduction of Live, a proto-subscription model that cost $19.90 per month. By 2019, they were individually $150. At this time, they also introduced a full subscription licensing, which was either $19.90 a month or $239 a year. You know where this is going, don't you? Adobe acquired Algorithmic in early 2019. Yeah. There was an adjustment period from the time Adobe announced the acquisition to it being finalized. So in 2020, the Substance3D.com site was still selling licenses for Substance products. However, at this point, they had dropped the perpetual models you could purchase directly from them. Like I said before, I had purchased this much earlier. We were able to download the latest version before the switch to Adobe happened. Once the switch happened, Adobe continued to charge $19.99 a month for the core Substance programs Painter and Designer. For $50 a month, you get a modeler program and 20 more assets per month. I don't know why that makes it double, but okay. Surprisingly, an early quirk of Algorithmic was that they sold perpetual licenses on Steam for all of their products. Even now, you can get perpetuals of Substance Painter and Designer there, although you need to pay for every upgrade. And starting this year, they upped the price from $150 each to $200. Also, I don't consider Steam software the same as perpetual local software. As many people already know with digital libraries, if something is on Steam, that means they can take it away anytime they want. So whenever Adobe decides not to do that anymore, I'm guessing it's a contract negotiation with Algorithmic, but that's just a guess, they will remove it from the store. More than likely, I will have to find alternatives. But once again, I'm losing another tool. Another tool, another social media platform, another game, another show, another movie, another. At least I have beans. I can even make my own. What is that? Microsoft says goodbye to clip art. Since the 1990s, Microsoft Office provided libraries of drawings users could simply click and use, and many of the most recognizable images were drawn by one woman, Kathy Belleville. She ended up at Microsoft, working on PowerPoint. In 1995, she left the company and came up with the idea for Screen Beans. Screen Beans is a series of simple black stick figure guys wearing hats. Maybe you've seen the one of a guy jumping up in the air, clicking his heels in celebration, or the one where there's a guy with a light bulb over his head like he's just had a great idea. Larchuk. Belleville designed the figures to be universally relatable, and she sees them everywhere. Belleville. I've been to Africa and seen them on a menu. I've been sitting on planes and seen people walk by me with them on t-shirts. Larchuk. She sold those drawings to Microsoft, but she did not get rich off of them. Belleville. Everybody thinks because they've seen your art all over, oh, you must have made millions of dollars on these things. And I think for 100 images, they paid me $10,000. Once. Damn it, I knew they looked familiar. Okay, for legal reasons, this isn't Screen Beans. It's my own thing. He's not black, but very, very dark blue. And the shape isn't the same. On purpose. It doesn't match the drawing on purpose. But okay, redact my earlier statement. We don't even have beans. Subscription models go hand in hand with cloud-based software, together known as Software as a Service, or SaaS. You have something installed locally, but the company you purchase from can restrict your use of it. They can require you to have an internet connection to use it. You don't own the software, you're renting it. We're all familiar with this by now. But the other thing you might not realize is that this also drastically changed how software development happens. When I was looking at prices for Substance, I found a page on Adobe's website that didn't list all the information you'd expect. It was showing me different plans, but not what programs were included in them. Funnily enough, when I checked it out on a different day, same exact page, I saw an FAQ section at the bottom that clarified what programs were included. Turns out, the whole FAQ section is a content fragment whose information is pulled in after the page is loaded. So if that call fails or some other error occurs, you don't see it. So, on the page meant to help you compare plans, it sometimes won't show you what software is included in those plans. Now, this is a really common, relatively minor bug. And to be fair, their new code does a way better job preventing the issue. This isn't bad because of a bug. It's bad because of the business decision to bury the data. And I know it was a business decision because back in October of 2023, they did display the software information at the top of the page. Move fast and break things was famously said by Mark Zuckerberg, meant as a philosophy for early Facebook's rapid development. As mentioned before, the open source tech the web runs on is basically in a state of constant change. If you work in web, you're probably used to that. But web has always known fast development. Software hasn't. With web, you get a lot of stuff for free, because the end user is going to run your code within a program they already have, their browser. But with software, you get nothing for free. Even if you use some kind of framework, it's still more work overall. Software doesn't lend itself as well to the move fast and break things philosophy, but businesses who run on a quarter schedule like it. Since it's possible to deploy software to users via a cloud-based system, you can get updates more often. Not like how it was in the past where a user would need to hop on the modem and download a large update, or even further back where your update was simply waiting for the next version of the software to come out. This ease of use means expectations have changed on both sides. There's pros and cons to this, but mostly cons. Pro. You can roll out experimental features and see if users like them. Con. You will have experimental features pushed on you whether you like it or not. Pro. You can receive customer feedback and implement it a lot faster. Con. You are now quality assurance for a software that you pay for monthly. So if something breaks, you lose work time, or worse, your files may become corrupted, especially if you can't roll back the changes or if files aren't backwards compatible. For the programmers, if you push something that breaks your customer software, you are going to need to fix that as soon as possible, or pull the update entirely. So however many hours, nights, or weekends that takes. This has also contributed to software's rapid evolution. As mentioned several times throughout this video, one of the biggest problems with not being able to afford software you need on the job is not being able to keep up with it. I don't do much video editing. In college, I made animations and I put stuff together for my demo reel. Back then, I remember learning Adobe Premiere in an afternoon. It was just that easy. When I started making this video, I downloaded it again, thinking it would be a good way to cobble everything together. It was not. So much has changed that I would need to spend time relearning it. The program's complexity increased over time, which is normal with any software. But now that growth is hyper-driven by external pressure. So a lot of updates aren't based on need or optimization, or even things customers want. And again, unlike perpetual licensed software, Premiere now has a variable price. If I reinvest time into it, I may not be able to afford it later. So is that upfront hardship worth it for this project? No. The decision to not use Premiere was easy. Another Adobe product I needed was Photoshop. Luckily, that hasn't changed as much, but some things did. For instance, since I've used it, they overhauled the brush system. It used to be that you could select a brush shape and then toggle between erasing or drawing with that. Now the brush shape is tied to the type of tool that it is. So if I were to switch between a brush and an eraser, my brush shape would change as well. After a long time Googling, because I didn't know what keywords to use, I found a solution. You have to hold down a key while you switch in order to maintain the old functionality. The reason I'm not telling you what key that is because I've already forgotten it. I also found this other guy who wasn't happy about the change.
Period. End of story. That's how it has always been, and that's how it should be. If I wanted the smudge tool, I would have selected the smudge tool before showing the brushes. If some developer with more brains than sense about him or insisted that this was an improvement, that you could select the tool you want. Brushes would work with your chosen tool. They could have at least filter the brush results to show only the brushes and presets that work with the tool selected. Why would there be any reason to make my tool selector something completely new and select other brushes as an option from the option menu? After having used it since 1988, every time I used to go back and forth between the brushes palette, the name, tool present selector, and the tool palette. Now I have yet to reason to go back to see how many people use the new way for 6 months. It shouldn't be options and person make the default as Adobe developers only for some areas and coding for my software that they can use half of their lives. More issues with their facets 500 times product. If I were in charge at Adobe, I'd fire the product manager and hire someone who understands how to implement changes better. This is outrageous and disrespectful, and Adobe should be changed since I began to live.
And I understand, software often changes in ways customers don't like. But at least in the past, if you didn't like something, you could keep your old version of it. Now, in Creative Cloud, you only have the last couple versions available to you, and you will slowly be forced forward. Even for people who find ways around it, if they want to remain professional, they'll still be forced to learn whatever the new way of doing something is. Both Adobe and Autodesk have student plans that are free, and that's great, but students graduate. If companies want people to use their programs, they need to know how to use them. Oh, sweet. There's my master's in business certificate. I don't really feel like printing it. Controversial opinion time. For certain software, companies should consider making it free for everyone. And I mean commercially free too. Not everything. If you're able to sell a piece of software with perpetual licenses, then I think it makes sense to keep selling it like that. But if it's something that costs, for instance, just off the wall, no reason, $200 a month, then you're pricing out everyone except businesses. For years, some of the largest software companies have aligned themselves and changed their models to chase businesses, not individuals. And yes, I understand that was the point of the whole flex pricing model. But if I, an individual, wanted to purchase tokens, as poor a financial decision as that would be, I still could. Look, I'm at checkout. Ooh, maybe I'll do it. Maybe I'll skip rent this month so I can open a nearly obsolete 3D program 7 times. If someone works for a company, then that company should be licensing the software. But when a person leaves that job, they should still have a way to access it. What small amount of money people make from selling their art, videos, music, games, etc., is nothing compared to what companies would gain if more people knew their software. If no one on the job market uses the software a business purchased from you, why are they paying you thousands for enterprise licenses? Their best candidate for a role may be someone who used 3ds Max like 5 years ago, but now they use Blender because that's all they could afford. Also, if you are one of the companies responsible for me losing multiple tools over the course of my lifetime, I am going to avoid you like the plague. Because you will do to my client, to my employer, what you did to me. Make it free for individuals to use personally and commercially, and you'll have less competition popping up all the time that you have to buy.
Business degrees revoked.
Yeah.
Bachelor of Science in Business Administration revoked. Master of Business Administration revoked.
Yeah, I figured. In the unlikely event this video's message isn't heard and acted on by every CEO in the world, and things continue on the path they're currently on, what can we do as consumers of these products? How to protect ourselves from predatory software practices? Something you'll hear a lot of people say is go open source. In the 3D space, Blender is recommended a lot. If you're someone who wants to learn 3D and is having trouble deciding which one to go with, I would recommend Blender to you. As I said before, I learned 3ds Max in school, worked with it and Maya professionally. Blender can do everything the others can. I don't feel hindered using it. For sure, there are areas of improvement, and because Max and Maya are geared toward industries, they'll have better tools to speed up workflow. But for my purposes, Blender is perfect. I made all the animations, the motion graphics, and I edited this video with it. And then I donated to them because it's open source and I wanted to continue to exist. Also, I bought the socks and shirts. Please open your merch store again, Blender. I need another fix. Also, maybe make 3D printed stuff. That would be cool. Earlier, I mentioned needing another program to couple everything together, and for that, I ended up using another software that is a free version, DaVinci Resolve. Unfortunately, it's not always as simple as telling people to go open source, because not all open source is the same. For example, in the DevOps space just recently, a company called HashiCorp, yeah, that's the name. Adding corp to your name is such a great way to announce that you're a real-life villain. Anyway, HashiCorp changed the licensing of their industry-dominant Terraform from open source MPL, Mozilla Public License, to a BSL, or Business Source License. Meaning, depending on a lot of factors, from that point on, you have to pay for it. Terraform is a tool that allows you to quickly set infrastructure for any server-based solutions like websites, apps, software as a service. If you're wondering what any of that means, please don't. Save yourself. I wish I didn't know. But long story short, it's something that's holding together a lot of the things that you use. If a company wanted to remove it from their stack, it would be a lot of work. Because of the nature of open source licensing, you can still get the version prior to the license change. However, especially in this space, it's important to stay up to date. So if that code base is not maintained, then it becomes unusable. Shortly after HashiCorp's announcement, some devs took the OS code and created OpenTofu, which they plan to maintain. So, go open source. But just like anything else, there's no guarantee something will stay open source. So what else can you do? 2. Learn universals and look for software that has them. The ability to script tasks or code add-ons, non-destructive workflows like layers or environments like node editors are things that don't take a lot of time or effort to learn when they're duplicated in other software. For instance, I didn't know a whole lot about DaVinci, but I got pretty far with their Fusion node editor just poking around. Number 3, engage in online learning communities. Provide education if you can. For a long time, I've hesitated to make tutorials on things I know, mainly because I don't feel like an expert on anything, especially when it comes to art and production practices. However, what I can do is focus on the software I use. I can take the questions I had learning it and provide those answers directly on wikis or Stack Overflows. I can also contribute to documentation sites. This especially helps during times when something has gotten too expensive and people are looking for alternatives. Finding answers may be the thing that helps someone detach from an old piece of software. Side note, if you do have the ability to make tutorials or classes, please consider doing this in a text-based way rather than a video one. For starters, that makes the information you give much easier for web crawlers to document, thus extending its life even if the site goes down. But also because we're deluged with videos, and they're not as easy to search as a text-based tutorial would be. Number 4. I struggled with whether or not to include this one, and I decided I wouldn't just say learn to code, because that's no small task. Learning something like a node editor or any visual coding environment can be a step toward that, but if you don't want to code, it'll be a lot harder to learn it. But what you can do, as mentioned before, several software packages come with the ability to program your own tools and workflows directly. For instance, Photoshop, Word, Blender. It's symbiotic since people will often sell the tools they make or provide them for free, which increases the value and usage of the software package. So even if you can't code, you can still get involved with these communities. You can support people who do make new tools. A lot of them make their scripts free on code repository sites like GitHub. Maybe there's a plugin out there that can help you transition, and you can begin collecting resources to carry elsewhere. If there's not an easy way to install an add-on, then at most you just need to learn enough to run those scripts. If you want to, you could help QA or battle test for the people who make them. Finally, and this one is less concrete, but I think it's important, we need to keep talking about this stuff. I know complaining about subscription services has done little to stop companies from forcing them on us, but we can try to be constructive instead of just venting to one another, although that's important too. For instance, Daniel Art made this list if you're trying to get away from Adobe products. You can find it here, and there's also a GitHub form of this by Kenny NL with some more alt program suggestions. We shouldn't wait for a profit-driven company to act like they're not driven by profit. We can find ways to walk away as a group. If you have more actionable steps for this list, please let me know. I didn't mention it previously, but the man who created ZBrush went by the nickname Pixelator. In the early days of ZBrush, he answered questions and posted updates on the ZBrush forums. I think a big reason this tool was so helpful to artists is because Pixelator was an artist himself. Warnock, the co-founder of Adobe, wasn't just a business owner. He's also known for his algorithms. Substance, or the company Algorithmic, goes all the way back to the early 2000s. They didn't just start in the 2010s with a groundbreaking lineup. They made earlier attempts to solve problems, and those evolved over time. The people who created these things were passionate about them. There's a story behind not just every program, but every technical, structural, and design decision within those programs. That's hard-won knowledge that we're not keeping track of, or very rarely keeping track of. I'm not going to propose a boycott of any specific software or software company, because I don't think a boycott would work. In a previous section, I said companies making industry-standard software should consider making their products free for individuals, and while I still think that's diamond advice for burgeoning software companies, I don't know if that would work for established ones who've already lost their users' trust. Because even if all these companies started selling their products for $1 tomorrow, we still know their ultimate goal. They are still going to try and dominate their market, push out competitors, and eventually charge as much as possible while not actually improving their products because improvement and innovation require expensive internal teams. And at a certain user saturation point, software improvement directly conflicts with increasing profit. So we'd end up back here eventually. All we can do is walk away forever. At the start of this video, I admitted that I was willing to pay a lot for a piece of software, but eventually it cost so much that I couldn't even save for it. It was simply out of my reach. Back then, I couldn't recognize it, but I was never going to use that program again. And eventually, just like XSI, that program won't exist. And neither will the company making it. As soon as a customer exodus starts, they won't recover. It takes surprisingly little for these companies to combust. All that being said, I wanted to prove my thesis wrong. I don't want there to be nothing you can do. I don't just want to complain, and I don't want to anesthetize anyone. So what do you do when you don't have any power in the world? I know it's not much, but it's something I can do. Also, fuck Autodesk. The donation is because I want to support Blender, but it's a little bit of spite. Like at least $5 worth of spite. And you know what, while I'm at it, and moving forward, I'm going to be more selective about what I choose to learn. And I'm going to be more open and share that knowledge with others. As for the things I've already lost, I'll find some catharsis. Maybe through art. Has anyone ever tried that?